services. Did I say that Pa's from Gallup, or did I just say he's the managing partner in the whole of Europe? I think is what I said. I didn't even say where you work. You just manage Europe, Pa. So over to you, Pa, up to the stage. Really excited to introduce you.
Thank you. Oh, that's for me. Thank you very much. If there is a job opening, I will gladly manage Europe. Not that I'm complaining about our...
It's needed, Pa.
I'm just saying, okay. Pleasure to be here. So my name's Pa, P-A, short and easy one. And I have the pleasure today to talk to you about a topic that, depending on the day and time, either frustrates me, engages me, on some moments inspires me, overwhelms me, and that's the topic of diversity and inclusion. It's a topic that, it's been with us for a really long time, but it's become stronger, more present, at least, I would say, than ever in recent years. And it's particularly, why it affects my emotions so much, perhaps has a lot to do with my own personal story. So I was born and raised in the Gambia to a Muslim dad and a Christian mom. My dad wasn't allowed to see me for the first 3 months of my life because, they don't like each other so much out there. We're evolving on that as well, but that was an interesting piece where I got to sense how being different or different people can translate into negative experiences, but also into positive experiences when, at the end of the day, my granddad on my mom's side became my dad's best friend after initially hating the guy. So I was able to observe how that can change. I moved to Germany at the age of 14. Wow, talk about... to the Germans in the room. I still love my people, but coming from the Gambia, that was a shock. And now working with Gallup for the last 15 years, and I would argue one of the most inclusive cultures, has really taught me a lot about the potential for inclusion, the value that diversity can bring to the table. And I have some slides prepared I'd like to share. And the idea is firstly just to go through a little bit around understanding the topic, which I'm sure everybody in this room does, so I can skip that one perhaps. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the complicated dynamic of inclusion and diversity, because it's not as straightforward as we all like to make it sound. And I'll talk a little bit about that. We all want to believe diversity is inherently good. Little bit, how do you call it again? God, I can't see. Now I can't speak any language. What happens when you speak 4 languages is you end up speaking none. Jumping to the point, I don't know how you say it in English, but diversity is not inherently good. In many cases, our data shows it actually creates a mess. It makes things more painful. It creates a lot of negative emotions. I know nobody wants to say that, but that is the reality of, the complexity of human beings and of human emotions. And then I want to wrap it up talking about some of the building blocks that we've seen in our partnerships with organizations that really are able to create those inclusive workplace environments where diversity does become an advantage, does contribute to innovation, does contribute to your performance, your culture, well-being, and so on and so forth. All right, just some basics around diversity. We are in a day and age where diversity has come to mean mostly 2 things. That's why I was so happy to see Mike here today, because it's mainly, at least in Europe, it's either about gender and increasingly about race. Those are the 2 dimensions of diversity that organizations look at. Not saying those are 2 not important ones, and I guess you have to start somewhere. But we need to be honest to ourselves that diversity is a lot more sophisticated and a lot more complex than the color of your skin or your gender. Matt and I might be 2 men, but we might be more different than me and any other woman in this room. So how do we get to the different dimensions that really get to what diversity truly is? And in some of the organizations that we partner with, it's really about leveraging analytics to really understand which diversity actually matters. And in some organizations, we'll find that it's more sort of the secondary elements of diversity that really create different experiences. What kind of university you went to or what kind of degree you have is more critical to your employee experience sometimes than your race or your gender. So organizations that are studying this have to be able to leverage data to really dig or drill down into which elements of diversity actually matter most for our workforce. It doesn't imply we ignore the others, but oftentimes we are running blind by not looking at all the dimensions. I saw an organization where it was an American organization. We could collect data like this. We could never collect data like this. In Europe, who is a smoker and who's not? And we discovered that whether you're a smoker or not was more predictive of how included you felt, how well you felt you could be yourself, because it was a manufacturing environment. A lot of the people in that environment were smoking, and when you smoked, you were part of the in-group. When you didn't smoke, you were not part of the in-group. Now, who would think of smoking or non-smoking when we think about diversity and inclusion? But that is an element that can really make for inclusive workplace environments or not. Now, I'm sure none of you can collect data like that. We're in Europe, we don't do that. But there might be other data sources that you have at your disposal that can really help you to get a sense of what actually makes for inclusive work environments or not. Now, I'm not going to spend more time on the topic of diversity today. As important as it is, I really want to focus on inclusion itself. And what we at Gallup have done, as many of you will know Gallup, we've been asking questions around the world for 90 years almost now, James? Yeah, almost 90 years around what do people think, feel, how does it translate into behaviors, what does it do to them, how do they interact with others. And one of the topics we've studied long and hard is when do people feel they can be themselves, when do people feel they can be heard, when do people feel included, when do people feel safe. Psychological safety is one of the terms that we've heard today. And we've identified 3 very practical experiences or conditions that really make for whether people feel included or not. And I'd like to start off sharing those. These are, 1, employees feel treated with respect. At the very individual level, I am recognized, I am respected, I both by my colleagues, by my customers, by my boss, but generally I experience moments of where I feel I'm recognized as a human being, I am respected. The second condition that we find in inclusive workplaces is the manager. Our research has shown that the manager plays a critical role in culture. I loved hearing some of what was said earlier on around how we can lead from the top, how we can communicate and signal who we want to be. And if we demonstrate it from the top of an organization, the organization will realize that it's important and it's real. Well, when we look at our data, we find a slightly different picture. Sometimes communicating an aspiration from the top actually creates more problems because our lived experiences don't come from our CEOs. Nothing against the CEO in the room, very important people, CEOs, but our workplace experiences is determined by our managers. 70% of the variance in your experiences, how you experience work, what it does to you, which emotions you feel, are explained solely by who your manager is. So when we have managers who don't value people for what makes them different rather than valuing them for their strengths, then no matter what we as an organization communicate around inclusion and why it's important to us, our daily lived experience are in direct contradiction or contrast to what people hear. And sometimes that actually creates a cognitive dissonance. So I advise organizations, if you're not going to change the local conversations, how about you just promise nothing? You're just going to end up frustrating more people because that is what happens. People look at the posters that claim we want to be the most inclusive workplace environment, but then they have a manager who doesn't care about what they have to say, who doesn't make them feel that their opinions count. In that case, you're creating extra frustration that maybe you would not have created if you just not made any promises. By the way, I'm not saying don't make any promises. Please do make promises, but only when you're also ready to take the steps to bring those promises to life. Otherwise, you're frustrating your workforce. And the emphasis on managers we found is nothing against subjective bias or unconscious bias trainings. Those can be really helpful. But when we look at the manager experience in them, they tend to feel negative for managers. They tend to feel like you're telling me everything that's wrong with me. We do need to explore that as well. But what we found that really works is when you equip managers to recognize the strengths of every individual, the uniqueness of every individual. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with Gallup's sort of strengths philosophy and approach to strengths, helping every individual recognize how truly unique you are. We're not 4 types, we're not 8 types, we're a lot more sophisticated than that. How do you help managers to really understand the unique strengths, unique thought and behavioral patterns that everybody brings to the table? When managers can do that, then we feel included. It's not easy, by the way, because we are so fundamentally different. Giving managers a language, access to those differences in a positive way, where we're looking at how those differences can contribute and add value rather than how those differences are something we have to manage and control. That really helps to create inclusive environments. And finally, at the organizational level, people feel they're in an inclusive workplace environment when they feel that leaders and the organizations, and when I say leaders, I don't mean the local leaders, I really mean organizational leaders, will do ethically the right thing. Meaning, if I complain or if I log a complaint, I know that my organization will take it serious. I know that our leaders will be ethical. They will be compliant in how they deal with it. And this is where, to the points that were just being made, how we communicate can really be very, very effective to demonstrate this is important to us as an organization, this matters to us, and it's coming from the top. So these are the 3 conditions that we see that really make for inclusive workplace environments based on the data that we've analyzed across thousands of organizations. Now, just to use one to make a case for why it is important, one of the questions we ask in many of our surveys is, do you feel treated with respect at work? And by the way, globally, 14% of people feel disrespected at work on a regular basis. That's 14% of people going to work feeling disrespected. And people who feel disrespected at work, 90% of them report feeling some form of discrimination, from sexual harassment to mobbing, you name it. So that respect piece is foundational for a culture of inclusion. Now, we all know that the science, we all know the studies, that when you get these 2 things right, it has so many positive effects in terms of job satisfaction, well-being, it reduces conflict. So the data and the studies are really there that when you get this right, it has a meaningful effect on performance and people's well-being, all of that. So it's worth our while. Yet the reality is when we ask people in organizations, do you feel that your organization is taking this serious? Only 55% of people actually feel that their organizations has policies to promote diversity and inclusion. Now, we could argue probably we haven't studied this for 20, 30 years like some of the other topics. Maybe if we look at it 20, 30 years ago, that number would have been 5%, right? So just to look on the bright side here, this might actually represent a lot of progress, but it's obviously nowhere near enough given the importance of the topic, not just in terms of our culture, but, and Mike touched on this, our increasingly diverse our customer bases, right? It's not just about doing the right thing. That's a big part of this topic. It's also about making money, right? Which I think most of our organizations are here to do. Well, not only, but they don't make money, they don't survive. So we need them to make money. And they increasingly have very diverse customer bases. So just to be able to tap into that customer base, we do increasingly need to be more diverse or inclusive of diversity. Now, what is the complicated dynamics of diversity and inclusion? And I've touched on that a little bit. Now, what we see, and I'm going to be in Gallup, I have to do this with data, so bear with me. And I wanted to share some data on how engaged and included people feel at work in contrast to the level of diversity that people experience. And here's an organization from the retail industry that we looked at. And we looked to see what impact does diversity and inclusion have, or separately, do diversity and inclusion have on engagement? And we did 2 things. One, we looked at teams where they were sort of imbalanced. In this case, we were just looking at gender diversity, with just one dimension of diversity, like I shared. And we looked at engagement levels, and engagement includes a big chunk of inclusion, right? Engagement is a little bit more than that, but a big part of engagement is really about feeling included, feeling you can voice your opinion, feeling cared for and appreciated as you are, as a person. Does somebody care about you as a person, not as a professional, but as a person? And then we looked to see how these different groups were performing. And there's a real interesting story here that touches on what I just shared earlier on. The lowest performance we see is when we neither have inclusion or diversity, 3.61% growth in those retail stores. Now, when you add sort of diversity to it, gender diversity in this case, it barely nudges up. And in some organizations we've looked at, we've even seen it go down. In this particular case, it moves up from 3.61 to 4.1%. Now, what happens when we say, forget diversity, let's just create an inclusive workplace environment where people feel engaged, their voices matter? Performance jumps up to 6.2% growth, simply in the absence of diversity, but just creating an inclusive environment. And obviously the goal, though, as you see on this slide, is when we get both right, when we get both inclusion and diversity right, that's when we see the strongest performance piece. And I think it's important for us, for those of you working in this space, that we're very honest about this finding, that diversity alone does not drive performance. It can, in some cases, actually have the negative effect. And here's a case, it's one organization in the US that we studied, but I thought it was really interesting, where we looked to see what diversity, and in that particular case, racial diversity, can do to engagement levels, how engaged people feel at work. And on the left side, you see those teams where this was not the most engaged organization in the world, to be fair. But one thing we discovered was when we have no diversity, particularly between the manager and the employee relationship, we had 4% only being emotionally fully engaged at work, and 36% being actively disengaged at work. So that was already disastrous to begin with, right? Not a great place to work. Well, add some diversity to that mix, and it becomes even more explosive. We saw active disengagement jump to 48%, and engagement levels drop marginally to 3%. And this was one case, but it does show a pattern we've seen in other organizations that in the absence of inclusion, diversity can actually be a problem for your business, for your performance. And again, it doesn't mean we give up on diversity. It just means we need to get it right so that we can actually tap into the value of it. Now, we've all seen these studies, though. We all know what the data tells us, that when we experience a more inclusive workplace, we are more likely to experience a state of happiness at work. We're more likely to have good friends at work in an inclusive environment, 1.8 times more likely to have friends at work if it's inclusive. And we're more likely to experience a positive work-life balance. So in the era of well-being, and a few people have said it today, our data around the world sadly confirms what a lot of people have said. Negative emotions are on the rise, and the next pandemic is a mental health pandemic. It is coming, sadly, very strongly. We've seen there are more people lonely, there are more people worried, there are more people sad than ever before, and we've been tracking this for the last 50 years. Sorry, I don't mean to depress this group. I'll find something positive to say. But if we create inclusive environments, we can actually manage for that. Is that a nice positive spin? Did I save it? Okay. Oh man, I'm going negative again. Damn it. The reality, though, is negative. The reality is that 45% of people at work experience some form of discrimination in the last 12 months. The reality is that only 30% of people feel that their opinions count at work. Now, how are we inclusive when people don't feel that their voice matters? Only 30% of people feel that their voices matter at work. 12% have experienced non-sexual harassment in the last 12 months, and 3% have experienced sexual harassment. And then, on the topic of respect, like I shared, only 14, well, no, not only, I would say 14% feel disrespected at work on a regular basis. So the numbers show that despite all of the data suggesting that there's real value to be had in creating inclusive workplace environments in terms of people's well-being and how they feel about their lives, but also in terms of performance, the reality is this: it's not happening. So what are some ideas to really think about how we approach this? What have we seen work across organizations that we study with, that we partner with on these journeys? And one is, and you might have noticed I don't use diversity, equity, inclusion. I use diversity, inclusion more, and I know this is a semantics thing. In Europe, we're still more, at least in mainland Europe, where I work mainly in Germany, we still only refer to diversity and inclusion. In the UK and in the US, we've really seen that move to DE&I. But where I think the EPs can really help to drive the D&I agenda is really through differentiation. And the first thing is that D&I strategies need to be operationalized locally. One experience we've had with a large American organization that we work with a very European footprint was to look at the racial differences in employee experiences. And we discovered that really just looking at it across racial lines made no sense, because the black experience in the UK did not at all correlate or match with the black experience in the US. So when we're talking about, this is how we're going to drive racial diversity without taking those local idiosyncrasies or differences into consideration, we might be headed down the wrong path. The second thing we look at, we discovered where equity can really make a difference, is to focus on understanding the directional differences that exist. So one thing we learned that surprised many of us, and it might be new to some of you, is that diversity flows bottom up, while inclusion flows top down. We have the least diversity at the top of most organizations, but they are the most inclusive environments. And we discovered that is why they're so inclusive, because there's no diversity there. It's very easy to be inclusive if we're thinking, acting the same, or come from the same backgrounds. On the other hand, when we look at the bottom of organizations is where we see the most diversity, yet sadly we see the least inclusion. What that creates is a conflict where we're not able to break our patterns in organization, because the top remains inclusive, positive, but zero diversity, while the bottom remains diversity, but is not inclusive. So we experience this clash in organizations that we partner with, that you might also experience in some of your organizations. At the team level, we create equity by recognizing two things. One, diversity does not generate inclusion, like I've shared multiple times today. But also inclusion does not generally generate diversity. So we can have very inclusive workplace environments, like the top of many organizations, that inclusion only breeds a repetition or replication of the types of people that are there, because we know them, we appreciate them, we understand them, so we do more of the same rather than really breeding diversity. And one thing some organizations fully get, many, I don't want to say they don't get it, but they don't approach it in that very complex manner, is that these are two very distinct activities, and your activities to drive diversity can be completely unrelated to your activities to drive inclusion. And the fact that most of us kind of bring these two topics together actually muddies the waters. And my recommendation to organizations has been separate these topics conceptually, separate them in terms of who's responsible, separate them in terms of what metrics you're looking at, in terms of holding yourself accountable. And we're very far away from that. I think we've just taken the first step. We have directors of D&I. That's the first start. But it sometimes hardly doesn't make a lot of sense. All right? Now, what are the things that we do see that make sense? How much time do I have? 1 minute. 1 minute? Easy. It's my last slide. No. We see 3 levels to really creating that culture of inclusion. One, it's at the individual and team level, so our daily lived experiences, interactions on a day-to-day basis. 2, I touched on the role of the manager being crucial and critical for driving an inclusive workplace environment. And I'll tell you, most managers don't feel equipped to have this conversation. Most managers do not want to have this conversation at all. Recent data shows that 60% of managers are like, I'd rather not. Between diversity and well-being, those are the 2 topics that most managers just want to run away from. Not because they don't want to help, they're overwhelmed. These are really sensitive, challenging topics. Managers don't feel equipped to have the conversation. They feel they'll step into their mouth if they try to, so they just try to avoid the conversation altogether. But then finally, at the organizational level, we also need to address this. Now, there are 5 things we need to see, behaviors or experiences we need to see. At the individual level is that people need to be encouraged to be themselves. Obviously, we've touched on that today multiple times. 2, they need to feel they're a valued part of a team, because culture is fundamentally local. I know we all love to talk about company cultures. Sorry to break it to you guys, it doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a company culture. We always have a bell-shaped curve of culture, and sometimes the bell-shaped curve is a little bit more to the right, sometimes a little bit more to the left. Those are the organizational differences. But at the individual level, my culture is my direct colleagues and my boss. That's the culture I live in. And so we need to address it at that very local level, create that sense of you matter at that level. And you see how difficult that gets, because now we're talking about 10,000 conversations. Now we're talking about really going down one conversation at a time. But sadly, that is the hard work of driving or creating culture, creating inclusive workplace environments. Thirdly, experience strengths-based development, from how we manage performance to how we evaluate performance. When we introduce elements of strengths orientation in our interaction with employees, it creates more of a willingness to open up, more of a willingness to share, more of a willingness to be yourself, because you feel recognized for your strengths, not for how you're different, but really how you are unique in a very positive light. Thirdly, having inclusive conversations, I've already touched on it. Managers need help there, but as organizations, we need to be equipping managers to have those conversations, be it through tools, be it through knowledge, be it through training, be it also just through space to try things out, to experience, to make mistakes and try again. And finally, people need to trust their organization. We need to feel that, and this is where really, CEOs do matter a lot in terms of the messages that they signal into the conversation, into the organization, the decisions that they make, how they hold people accountable. That shows that it's truly important. Thank you very much. I think I was just in time. It was a pleasure talking to you.